Japan, a comparatively small island nation in East Asia, found within the northwestern Pacific Ocean. Japan, 1853, an end to the Edo period of isolation. 1860, Japan sends representatives of their country to the United States to confirm and sign the Harris Treaty, also known as the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, an agreement that acquired diplomatic and commercial exchange between the emerging nation of Japan and the United States. 1894, the First Sino-Japanese War, a conflict between the Japanese Empire and the Qing dynasty over control of Korea. 1937, the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War. 1941, the Lend-Lease Act. Japan's previous foreign relations influenced the diplomatic relationship between the United States and Japan before Pearl Harbor. The involvement in Japan's affairs by the U.S. prior to Pearl Harbor was the cause of Japan's inability to continue expansion. As President Roosevelt formalized U.S. support to China through the Lend-Lease Act, tensions escalated between the two nations. Japan presented tentative proposals attempting to reach a diplomatic resolution. Debate and negotiations over the proposals resulted in the operation of Pearl Harbor, as a diplomatic satisfactory result was not achieved by either nation. This ultimately led to the United States' involvement in World War II and influenced international diplomatic relations. The attack on Pearl Harbor stemmed from growing hostility between the nations of Japan and the United States of America, initially developed during World War I. Americans represented equal opportunity to exchange goods between countries, specifically China, through the diplomatic open door policy, while Japan represented a policy designed to allow Japan and East Asia to form a military and economic association through the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere over Western control. This conflict between nations grew over a series of events through debate and diplomatic agreements and documents through the next couple of decades. Several contributing factors, including political instability in both China and Japan and the Great Depression, were the leading cause of Japanese expansionism during the 20th century. After the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, the nation of China had become divided between the nationalists and the communists. During the 1920s, Chiang Kai-shek, or Chiang Kai-shek, a military leader in China, led a nationalist movement called the Kuomintang, and more predominantly known as the Chinese Nationalist Party, to unify China, including Manchuria, and launched the Northern Expedition in 1926 in an alliance with the Chinese Communists. However, in 1927, Chinese nationalists turned against the Communists, creating political tension throughout China. Meanwhile, Japan's Kuomintang army and political leadership at the time were in an internal conflict over military power. Just 2 years later, the Great Depression impacted the United States and soon after, the rest of the world. The impact of the economic depression was especially devastating to Japan, whose economy relied on both imports and the ability to export Japanese manufactured goods. In 1930, the U.S. implemented the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, a protective commerce management act which increased the price of Japanese imports by 20% in the U.S. and destroyed Japan's ability to export goods, which led to a rise of unemployment in Japan, adding economic instability to already present political instability. This act pushed the Japanese to look abroad as the need to acquire their own materials increased. Japanese saw Asian mainland as a potential to obtain raw materials and Japan's only means of survival. The target, Manchuria. It all started with an explosion at a Japanese-owned railway in Mukden, Manchuria on September 18, 1931, that the Kuomintang army claimed was an attack from the Chinese. This technique, known as a casus belli, was used to initiate and justify expansion in Manchuria. By 1932, the Japanese had complete control over Manchuria, and the Chinese relinquished control of Manchuria through the Treaty of Tangu in 1933. Japan consequently used Manchuria as a puppet state for economic wealth, renamed Manchukuo. Japan benefited economically through the invasion of Manchuria, although this invasion worsened Japan's diplomatic relations with the Western world. This incident was criticized by the League of Nations and proved a signal to the Western world indicating Japanese abandonment of internationalism. During the years following, Japanese and Chinese relations worsened through a series of border clashes. The concern in the West over Japanese expansionism progressed when the Japanese attacked the Chinese in the Marco Polo Bridge incident, which led to the Second Sino-Japanese War, a war that would last for another 8 years. Through the early 1930s, the United States and much of the West remained neutral. The United States proclaimed its stance through a series of laws named the Neutrality Acts, endeavoring to prevent involvement in another foreign war with Japan. In December of 1937, the Japanese bombed the USS Panay, but later apologized and made restitution for the incident, calling it an accident. The Japanese apologized for their actions due to a certain weakness that could, if harnessed, be used to the great advantage of other nations. This was an extreme deficiency of natural resources essential to the advancement of Japan's military and economic success. Japan depended upon imports from other nations, principally the United States, to supply resources including oil, rubber, tin, steel, iron, and other essential war materials. As Japanese aggression in East Asia intensified, President Roosevelt made a statement regarding U.S. neutrality and the start of World War II in Europe. Even a neutral has a right to take account of facts. Even a neutral cannot be asked to close his mind or his conscience. As Japanese aggression in East Asia intensified, the United States initiated several trade embargoes on Japan, including termination of the diplomatic 1911 trade treaty with Japan and signing the Export Control Act. During the early 1940s, the U.S. approved aid to China, allowing the purchase of military supplies and materials, and further weakening Japanese relations. Through the Lend-Lease Act, the United States was allowed to continue aid to China while still maintaining its stance of neutrality. This policy was claimed vital to the defense of the United States. Japanese-American diplomacy worsened through aid to China. Japan implemented a program known as the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, aimed at removing Western powers from Eastern Asia as an attempt at further expansion. In September of 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, intensifying diplomacy between the West and Japan. The following year, Japan and the Soviet Union agreed with the Neutrality Pact, sanctioning expansion in Indochina and other conquests, a move that exacerbated diplomatic relations. Consequently, the United States placed a complete embargo on all Japanese exports, redirecting supplies to China through the Burma Road. The lasting debate between the United States and Japan was through a series of documents, the whole note representing the final proposal. As the Japanese military planned for an attack on Pearl Harbor throughout the summer of 1941, they requested a final diplomatic resolution. The Japanese initiated negotiations with two proposals in November of 1941, outlining their desire to maintain diplomacy with the United States. The first stated that Japan would agree to withdraw military involvement in Indochina if the U.S. would terminate military and economic aid to China. During a short period between proposals, the U.S. decoded a message stating that the Japanese had a backup proposal on the condition that the request was denied. On November 14, the U.S. replied, rejecting the proposal. 6 days later, the Japanese sent the second proposal, requesting an end to military involvement in Southeast Asia, as well as terminating military and economic aid to China, and the release of the oil embargo on Japan, supplying a required quantity of oil. Just before the United States was going to send a counter-proposal, they again received word about additional Japanese military conquests in Indochina, proving insincerity in Japanese diplomacy. Negotiations continued as the United States sent the final proposal, the whole note, that served as an ultimatum for the Japanese. The whole note demanded the evacuation of all Japanese troops from both French Indochina and nationalist China. The last debate in diplomacy between nations proved a failure, leading to the fateful day in December of 1941. By now, Hideki had decided that war was the last result, and plans for a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor were already laid.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
At the end of World War II, as Japan surrenders, General Douglas MacArthur states, "It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past, a world founded upon faith and understanding, a world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish, for freedom, tolerance, and justice, signifying a new era of history.